You saw them. You just did not know what you were looking at. That moment when something felt slightly off, but you could not name it. That night when something he said landed strangely, but you pushed the feeling aside. That early conversation where a small alarm went off somewhere deep inside you, and you looked at it for a second, and then, because everything else was so good, because he was so warm, because the feeling of finally being seen was so overwhelming, you let it go. You did not ignore the signs because you were stupid. You did not miss the signs because you were blind. You missed them because you were human. Because your brain was doing exactly what human brains are designed to do when they encounter something that looks like the fulfillment of their deepest needs. Because the very thing that made you perceptive enough to notice something was wrong in the first place was also the thing that was being deliberately exploited to keep you from trusting what you noticed. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand that completely. Not as an excuse. Not as a way of letting yourself off a hook you were never supposed to be on, but as the full, honest, psychologically accurate truth of why the signs were invisible. Not because they were hidden, but because everything around them was deliberately constructed to make them impossible to see clearly. But first, I need you to stop doing something that you have probably been doing since this relationship ended. Stop replaying the early moments looking for the version of yourself that should have known. Stop asking why you did not trust the feeling that something was wrong. Stop treating your inability to see the signs as evidence that something is fundamentally broken in your ability to read people and protect yourself. Because here is what I'm going to show you today. The signs were not just present, they were surrounded, deliberately, strategically, psychologically surrounded by everything that your specific brain needed to be shown in order to dismiss them. You were not missing the signs, you were being blinded to them, by someone who knew exactly what light to shine in your eyes. Before we go any further, I want to plant 4 questions in your mind. 4 questions that have lived inside you since this relationship ended, probably since the moment you finally understood what you had been through. Why did I feel something was wrong but convince myself I was overreacting? Why did the signs only become obvious after the relationship ended and not while I was inside it? Why did I trust him more than I trusted my own instincts even when my instincts were screaming? And the question that carries the most shame: why did I stay even after some of the signs became impossible to ignore? Hold those questions. Every single one of them will be answered before this video ends. And the answers are going to do something that very few things have probably done since this experience began. They are going to give you permission to stop blaming yourself. Now let me tell you about something that happened in a psychology study that changed the way researchers understand human perception. In the 1990s, psychologists Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris conducted an experiment that became one of the most famous demonstrations in the history of psychological research. They asked participants to watch a short video of 2 teams passing basketballs and count how many times the team in white shirts passed the ball. The participants focused intently on the task. They counted carefully. They watched closely. And in the middle of the video, a person in a gorilla suit walked directly through the center of the scene, stopped, thumped their chest, and walked off. More than half of the participants never saw the gorilla, not because they were not paying attention. They were paying extremely close attention. But their attention had been deliberately directed towards something specific: the white shirts, the passes, the counting, and that directed attention made them genuinely, completely unable to see something that was right in front of their eyes. This is called inattentional blindness, and it is one of the most important concepts you will ever encounter for understanding why you could not see the warning signs. Because in your relationship, your attention was being directed, constantly, deliberately, with extraordinary skill. Every time a red flag appeared, there was something else to look at. Something warm and compelling and emotionally overwhelming that pulled your attention exactly where he needed it to be. The love bombing itself was not just the reward. It was the misdirection. It was the white shirts. It was the thing he put in front of your eyes so that the gorilla could walk right through the center of your life and you would never look up from the counting. You were not inattentive. Your attention was managed. And that is a completely different thing. Now let me go deeper into the specific mechanisms that made the signs invisible, because understanding each one of them is what finally releases you from the belief that you should have known. The first mechanism is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance reduction. Human beings cannot hold 2 contradictory beliefs at the same time without experiencing profound psychological discomfort. When we believe 2 things that conflict with each other, Our brains go to work immediately to resolve the conflict, to find a way to make the contradictory information fit together so that we can maintain a coherent understanding of our world. In the early stages of your relationship, your brain held two pieces of information simultaneously. The first was everything he was showing you, the warmth, the attention, the extraordinary intimacy, the feeling of being seen and chosen and finally understood. All of the neurochemicals that were flooding your system as a result. All of the hope and joy and relief that the love bombing phase produced. The second was the small, quiet, occasional signal that something was off. The moment he said something that felt slightly controlling but laughed it off as a joke. The time he reacted to something small with a coldness that was gone so fast you almost wondered if you imagined it. The comment about an ex that revealed something about how he thought about women that made you pause for just a fraction of a second before he said something charming, and the pause dissolved. These two pieces of information were contradictory, and your brain, doing exactly what human brains are designed to do, worked to resolve the contradiction. Not by choosing to believe the warning sign, by finding a way to make the warning sign fit the positive narrative. He was probably just stressed. He did not mean it the way it sounded. I am being too sensitive. Everyone has moments like that. He is so good in every other way. This one thing does not define him. This is not weakness. This is not delusion. This is one of the most fundamental and universal mechanisms of human cognition. The brain protects the beliefs it is most invested in. And by the time the first warning signs appeared, your brain had already invested enormously, emotionally, neurochemically, narratively, in the belief that this relationship was real and good and exactly what you had always needed. The warning signs did not stand a chance against that investment, not because you were blind, because you were bonded. The second mechanism is something called the halo effect. The halo effect is a well-documented cognitive bias in which our positive impression of someone in one area unconsciously influences how we perceive them in all other areas. When someone is extraordinarily good in the areas that matter most to us, when they are warm and attentive and emotionally intelligent and seemingly devoted to our happiness, our brains extend that positive evaluation across every aspect of how we perceive them. We assume that someone who loves us this deeply must also be honest, must also be trustworthy, must also be fundamentally safe. We assume that someone who understands us this precisely must also have good intentions, because in most of our experience of human beings, those things go together. Depth of understanding and goodness of intention usually coexist. Warmth and trustworthiness usually coexist. Being chosen and being safe usually coexist. The halo effect made the warning signs almost literally invisible, because the brain had already decided, based on overwhelming evidence from every interaction that mattered, that this was a good person, a safe person, a person who loved you. And when the brain has decided something that firmly, incoming contradictory information is not processed neutrally, it is processed through the filter of the existing belief. It is interpreted in whatever way allows the existing belief to remain intact. The warning sign becomes a bad day. The red flag becomes a misunderstanding. The moment of coldness becomes stress he is carrying from work. The controlling comment becomes evidence of how much he cares. The halo was not ignorance. The halo was your brain doing what human brains always do when they have fallen deeply in love with someone who seems to be everything they ever needed. Protecting the story. The third mechanism is one that is rarely discussed, but perhaps the most important of all for understanding why you did not trust your own instincts, even when they were telling you something was wrong. It is called gaslighting, but not the gaslighting that happens later in the relationship when he openly contradicts your memory of events. This is an earlier, subtler form of gaslighting that begins almost from the very first moment you notice something that does not fit. In the early stages when you felt something was slightly off, when that quiet alarm went off somewhere inside you, what happened next? He almost certainly responded in one of a small number of specific ways. He laughed warmly and made you feel that you had misunderstood. He was affectionate and made you feel the concern was foolish. He became briefly vulnerable, sharing something about his past that explained the behavior in a way that activated your empathy rather than your caution. He was so genuinely warm immediately afterward that your perception of what you had just experienced began to feel unreliable. Each of these responses taught you something. They taught you that your instincts were not trustworthy, not through a single dramatic moment of telling you that you were crazy, through 100 small, soft, warm moments of making the instinct feel unnecessary. making the alarm feel like an overreaction, making your perceptiveness feel like a problem rather than a gift. By the time the relationship was fully established, your instincts had been quietly, gently, systematically trained to doubt themselves, not because they were wrong, because he needed them to be quiet. And a self that has been trained to doubt its own perceptions cannot accurately evaluate the warning signs it is receiving, because every time it notices something real, it immediately asks, "But am I just being too sensitive again? Am I seeing what is really there, or am I creating problems? Is this a real concern, or am I self-sabotaging something good because I am afraid of being happy?" That internal questioning, that automatic self-doubt that had been installed so carefully in the early months, was the most effective warning sign suppressor he had. You were not missing the signs. Your internal alarm system had been quietly dismantled. The fourth mechanism is what I want to call the sunlight problem. Imagine trying to see a single candle flame in the middle of the afternoon sun. The candle is burning, the light is real, but it is completely invisible because it is surrounded by something so much brighter that your eyes simply cannot resolve it. This is what the love bombing did to the warning signs. The warmth was so intense, the attention was so overwhelming. The feeling of being finally, completely, perfectly understood was so bright that the small, flickering warning signs that were also present were simply not visible against that background. This is not a failure of perception. This is a physical fact of how human visual and emotional processing works. We cannot see dim things clearly when we are surrounded by something overwhelmingly bright. And the love bombing was designed to be overwhelming. That was its function. Not just to make you feel loved, but to create a background so bright that nothing dim could be seen against it. The warning signs were candle flames in the afternoon sun, and you were not failing to see them. You were being blinded. Now let us talk about something that takes us deeper than the mechanisms of blindness. Because understanding why you could not see the signs while you were inside the relationship is one thing, but there is a question that many survivors find even harder to answer. Why did some of the signs become clearer as time went on, and yet leaving still felt impossible? Because here is the truth that most conversations about warning signs do not address. By the time some of the signs became impossible to dismiss, by the time the controlling behavior was undeniable, the gaslighting was happening openly. The warmth had become so inconsistent that you could no longer convince yourself it was just stress. By that time, something else had happened that made the signs almost irrelevant to the question of whether you would stay or go. The trauma bond had formed. We have talked in previous videos about what a trauma bond is and how it works. But in the context of warning signs, it is important to understand one specific thing about it. A trauma bond does not make you unable to see that something is wrong. It makes seeing that something is wrong feel irrelevant to the question of whether you can leave. You can know, clearly, consciously, with complete certainty, that what is happening to you is wrong. You can be able to list the signs. You can be able to name the behavior. You can be able to tell your friend on the phone exactly what he did and hear yourself say the words and know that they are true, and still feel completely unable to go. Not because you are in denial, because the bond that was created, the neurological, psychological, deeply human bond that formed during the love bombing phase and deepened through every cycle of warmth and coldness and warmth again, operates completely independently of your conscious awareness of the situation. You can know you are in a burning building and still feel unable to leave because every exit is on fire and the only person who has ever made you feel safe is the one who lit the match. That is not stupidity, that is trauma. And trauma is not a choice. Now I need to talk about something that is perhaps the deepest layer of why the warning signs were so hard to see. And it is something that requires a kind of honesty that can be uncomfortable, but that is ultimately the most liberating thing I'm going to say in this entire video. Many of the warning signs were things that, at a conscious level, you registered not as danger signals but as familiar signals. The intensity that should have been a warning, that felt like love because intensity had always been what love felt like in your experience. The jealousy that should have raised alarms, that felt like proof of caring because jealousy had always been present when someone truly valued you. The need to manage his mood carefully, that felt like intimacy and responsibility because learning to read and manage the emotional environment around you was something you had learned to do long before you ever met him. The warning signs did not feel like warnings. They felt like home. And this is not something to be ashamed of. This is one of the most human and most understandable things about how we move through the world. We recognize what we know, We are drawn toward what feels familiar. And when what is familiar was shaped by early experiences that were not always safe, when the template for love and intimacy and closeness that was installed in us in our earliest years included elements of unpredictability or anxiety or having to earn affection, then those elements in a new relationship do not trigger alarm. They trigger recognition. They feel like, finally, someone who understands the kind of love I have always known. Not because you wanted to be hurt, because the nervous system recognizes the shape of what it has always called love. And unlearning that recognition, building a new template for what love should feel like, that does not include the familiar anxiety, the familiar walking on eggshells, the familiar feeling of having to work to be worthy of warmth. That is the deepest and most important work of healing. Not because something was wrong with you, because something was taught to you, early, without your consent, before you had any ability to evaluate whether what you were being taught was true. Now, I promised you 4 answers to the 4 questions I planted at the beginning of this video. Here they are. The first question was, why did I feel something was wrong, but convince myself I was overreacting? You convinced yourself you were overreacting because he had already begun the subtle, early gaslighting that is the hallmark of narcissistic relationships from their very first days. Every time your instinct raised its hand, he responded with warmth or vulnerability or laughter that made the instinct feel foolish. Over time, your instincts learned that raising their hand produced discomfort and doubt rather than validation and action. So they learned to stay quiet, to reframe themselves as oversensitivity, to apologize for existing before they even finished forming. You were not overreacting. Your instincts were accurate from the very beginning. They were just being trained out of you in real time. The second question was, why did the signs only become obvious after the relationship ended and not while I was inside it? Because inside the relationship you were processing everything through the filter of the bond, the halo effect, the cognitive dissonance reduction, and the neurochemical flooding of the love bombing phase. All of these things actively altered your perception, not metaphorically, but literally at a neurological level. Once the relationship ended and the bond began to dissolve, once the love bombing was no longer present to create the blinding brightness, once the neurochemicals began to recalibrate, your perception cleared. The signs became obvious not because you suddenly became smarter, because the mechanisms that had been obscuring them were finally gone. The third question was, why did I trust him more than I trusted my own instincts even when my instincts were screaming? Because he had spent the early months of the relationship systematically positioning himself as more reliable than your instincts. Every time you expressed a concern and he responded with warmth and a perfectly reasonable explanation, your brain recorded, his read of the situation was right and mine was wrong. Every time you felt something was off and he made you feel oversensitive, your brain recorded, his perception is more trustworthy than mine. By the time your instincts were screaming, you had already been conditioned through dozens of small moments to believe that your inner voice was less reliable than his outer voice. You did not choose to trust him over yourself. You were trained to. The fourth question, the one that carries the most shame. Why did you stay even after some of the signs became impossible to ignore? Because staying and leaving are not decisions made by the part of your mind that processes information. They are decisions made by the part of your nervous system that governs survival and attachment. And by the time the signs were impossible to ignore, the trauma bond had already rewired that part of your nervous system to experience leaving as a greater threat than staying. Your survival system was not evaluating the signs. It was evaluating the threat of disconnection from the person it had been conditioned to depend on for safety, and it consistently chose the familiar danger over the terrifying unknown of being without him. You did not stay because you were weak. You stayed because your nervous system was doing exactly what it had been conditioned to do, choosing the devil it knew. Now let me leave you with something that I want you to carry with you after this video ends. The warning signs were there. You were not blind, you were human. You were bonded. You were surrounded by a brightness so overwhelming that the warning signals could not be seen through it. You were trained by someone who needed your instincts to be quiet to doubt the most accurate parts of yourself. You were running on a template for love that included elements that should have been absent from love entirely. None of that is failure. All of it is the experience of a person who was targeted precisely because of their capacity for love, their openness, their willingness to believe in the best of the person in front of them. You were not naive. You were genuine. And in a world full of people who perform love for their own purposes, being genuinely open to it is not a weakness. It is the rarest and most courageous way to move through the world. The work ahead of you is not about becoming someone who sees warning signs faster. It is about healing the parts of you that were trained to doubt what you saw. Rebuilding the relationship with your own instincts that was systematically dismantled. Learning to trust the quiet alarm that sounds before you have a reason to justify it. Learning to let that alarm be enough, without needing to explain it, justify it, or apologize for it. Your instincts were right from the beginning. They just needed you to believe them. And believing yourself, truly, steadily, without waiting for someone else to confirm what you already know. That is not just healing. That is freedom. Subscribe to this channel because every week we go deeper into the psychology of healing, manipulation, love, and what it truly means to come home to yourself after someone made you a stranger in your own mind. And remember this, the signs were there, you were there, and now you have something you did not have then. You know what you were looking at. That knowledge is yours forever, and it will never let the same light blind you again.